I kind of really like books where the the scariness is like the social interaction that is happening.
Hi, EdaBuddies. Welcome back to the EdaBuddies podcast. I'm your host, Kara. I am a developmental and copy editor, and on my show, we talk about writing, editing, and the friends you can make along the way. Today, we're visiting the world of literary thrillers with up-and-coming author Kat Hausler. There are some people for whom the word literary brings up images of upturned noses and dense, incomprehensible prose. But Kat doesn't believe this has to be the case. In her novels, concept and characters work together to create compelling narratives full of twists and suspense. Literary fiction is about telling a story while also exploring something deeper about the human condition, and it's not afraid to get experimental with its structure or use of language. If you're someone for whom literary fiction seems intimidating, I hope after this interview you'll be inspired to try it out.
I'm originally from Virginia, and I studied in New York and then ended up in Berlin, where I live now, because I originally wanted to major in creative writing, and then the college of NYU that I was at was like, that's not a major here. So I majored in German studies and did semester abroad here. And yeah, I was like, nope, it's not New York, it's this city.
So
Yeah.
it clicked for you. It felt like the spot for you.
Yeah. I mean, I'll say actually the first couple of days I was in Berlin, which was pretty different back then. It's just like 2007. I was like, is this even a city? Because there's no businesses near, this apartment. Because I was so used to the consolidation of New York, and like every single apartment building is going to have the shops downstairs.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, within a short amount of time, and then I discovered more stuff and was no longer like, but where do I buy toilet paper?
Right.
My first
Had to
thought.
get over that culture shock for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
What were some of the first, or like, what are some of the early stories that you remember really making you go, not just I like reading this, but I want to write something like this?
I want to say maybe Lois Duncan's books. I read a lot of those as kind of the preteen. I guess her most famous is I Know What You Did Last Summer, which is so different in the movie, but definitely reading those was something where I felt like, yeah, like it would be fun to also write books like this. And I mean, not that I only write thrillers or something, but I definitely I must have read like 20 of her books at that age. So
What do you feel like it was about those books specifically?
I think that there was just a lot of interiority with the characters and feeling like you really were experiencing stuff with them. And I mean, that's something that's still really important to me now. Like I tend to write everything either, I mean, mostly close third, sometimes first person, but like really just want to be in the character's head.
Can you talk a little bit about what makes something like literary versus just a regular thriller?
Yeah, I mean, literary in terms of it's not just about the plot, it's not just about what happens next and is it kind of a thrilling plot line, but it's about how the language is and, how things are phrased. And I most enjoy reading a thriller myself or any kind of book if the words just really flow. And I sometimes think like, oh, that's a beautiful sentence, or that's insightful. That's something I have felt before, but not been able to put into words myself. So I try to recreate that experience.
Yeah. So you've written 2 books so far, 2 full-length novels and several short stories. Just in general, what does your writing process look like? Where do you get your inspiration, and then how do you develop inspiration?
I am always being like, I wish my writing process were different from what it is.
I don't know a writer who doesn't think that.
Yeah. I just always have this vision that like other writers are much more organized somehow, but I often just start with just the smallest idea or even kind of maybe a feeling that I want to look into more. Like my first novel, Retrograde, is about basically this estranged couple where the wife then has retrograde amnesia and her estranged husband is like, oh, I don't know how to tell her, or am I just going to pretend this never happened and we're together? But I didn't initially think about this as like an amnesia plot line, but about the period in a relationship where things are just all going wrong and people start to have this thought like, what if we could go back to when it was different and when it was good and couldn't we start over? But they can't start over because the past is there and everything they've experienced and all the fights. So I was thinking about that in the case of my new novel, What I Know About July, which is about this anxious musician whose creepy number one fan who's basically stalking him disappears. And so my thought there was I'm just so interested in the kind of celebrity fan relationship. So I almost was just going to write a short story about that originally, and then I got really interested. So yeah, I guess my writing process is just I'm just always noting down like what if this, what if that, some weird idea I want to look into more and and then eventually kind of the scenes that I can actively picture and then kind of just later on trying to link it up and flesh it out.
So you write non-linearly? You kind of like just write as what you see and then you piecemeal it together, you quilt it together?
I would say I wrote Retrograde pretty linearly.
Yeah,
Like
so
why did
linear.
you say this word? I can't
I'm
pronounce it.
so sorry.
Okay, because that was one where I was very focused on kind of leaving the ending open as long as possible. So I was just doing like kind of scene for scene and trying to develop the two perspectives that way. What I know about July, I wrote some of the main scenes that I could really picture first, and then kind of had like sort of like placeholder notes, like, this is what needs to happen in between. And then I eventually went through and was kind of filling it all out. And that one I would say wrote the ending pretty early on. So that one was all over the place for sure.
That's really interesting though, that you kind of took a very different approach with your two different novels. And what I heard you say about both of them is that you started more with the concept, with the idea that you were trying to play with in an abstract sense. This idea of can we go back to the way things were, and using this story and this vehicle of amnesia to explore that concept. And then with this new novel, you are using the story of this musician and his fan to explore this like parasocial relationships that is like so prevalent in modern day. So it sounds to me like not shaped first by what the character is trying to do, but by the concept that you as the writer are exploring. Does that sound right?
I think it's kind of both because I would say, especially what I know about July is super character driven, but I think I arrived at that character because since he's such an anxious person who really has a lot of like imposter syndrome. So I think that naturally catered to the kind of relationship that I was looking at because it was so much more interesting to me to look at that concept of the parasocial relationship, like you were saying, if it's someone who thinks I'm not even famous, I'm not even good, I'm not a rock star. So, I think definitely, yeah, character is very important to me. I think it's both things coming together.
Yeah. I noticed that both of your books were set in Berlin. And I'm curious, was that just out of convenience for you? Or were you really like, is there something about the city that you really want to capture as part of your story world?
I'll say the city is a lot more relevant for what I know about July than it is for Retrograde because Retrograde, a lot of it takes place inside the same apartment. It's very claustrophobic. So it not super city specific in that way. But what I know about July, it's set in 2015. So on the one hand, it's kind of this backdrop with the refugee crisis and what was going on in Berlin at that time, but especially Berlin being a city where a lot of people are kind of, making ends meet and trying to pursue creative careers. And there's just a lot of different characters coming together, also some seedy sides to it. It's less and less so nowadays, but people have long talked about Berlin being like this city that's still becoming, it's not finished yet. So that was something that I thought kind of in a way was a parallel to my protagonist, who's like, he's like over 30, but he's trying to figure out how to be an adult and get his life together and, you know, become the person he wants to be and even know who that is. So in that way, Berlin definitely was like more than just a random setting.
Yeah, yeah. That's so cool. And specifically with it being thriller, there has to be a lot of like, well, you tell me actually. What do you feel like what do you feel like are the defining things that you have to have in order to make it a thriller?
Yeah, trick question. No, I think it has to have a feeling of suspense, although you can have that in other genres as well. I think there's often overlap to crime fiction. There's spoiler alert, there's definitely a crime or two or several happening in the book, but it's almost like you have to rule out the other genres to say that it's just that.
Mhm. I always think of thrillers as there's always a twist or several twists, you know? You think that things are going one direction, and then all of a sudden something happens and things are going in a totally different direction. Do you use that in your books? And, like, how do you make that happen? Because I feel like a lot of people want to write twists that seem like, "Wow, that came out of nowhere, and it was so satisfying," but then it just falls really flat for the reader.
I do love twists. I read so much O. Henry growing up. I mean, those are sometimes sort of like very, very obvious twists in a
Mhm.
way, but that was a big part of editing and also a big part of discussions with people who were giving me feedback, like beta readers or my agent at the time, just about how obvious should upcoming twists be? How obvious should you know, whatever the solution to the mystery, if you want to say that, how obvious should it be? And what I was striving for was that the clues or signs of what is going to happen or what has happened would not jump out at the reader at the time, but only that then in retrospect, like, oh, of course, that's why such and such. Hopefully, hopefully I got it to that point. You never know how people will read it.
So you said that that was a big part of the editing process. So I'm all interested in editing because I am an editor. So
Of course.
yes, so talk to me like what does the editing process look like for you? And then what did it look like when you actually got your publisher and had to do that process through them as well?
Yeah, I will say kind of because I did write this and do write a lot of things in kind of a, fly by the seat of my pants way. Editing is so important to me. I spend a lot of time on editing. So I think that, the first stage of me editing a manuscript is just really the most basic level of revisions that are kind of even structural or, making sure that so someone who's in a room is still in the room 5 minutes later, didn't, vanish into thin air. It's a really, really basic level. And then over time, once that's ironed out, making sure that characters are consistent and that the character traits that they have throughout, or if they've developed to change from that it makes sense. And then, you know, much later, the level of kind of really the language and the line edits, all about paring down wordiness.
Mm,
People are always like, don't use any adverbs and don't, this and that. I'm not that anal, but I do try to think like, okay, do I need all of these words? Can I consolidate this?
yeah. And that's so important to be able to do for yourself. Like a lot of, and it's really hard for a lot of authors to do to kind of take that step back and be like, do I really? but it's a crucial skill to develop. So, at what point do you go, all right, I've touched this as much as I can. I want to have somebody else look at it and get their feedback?
I mean, I think there were with my last book, there were definitely several points where I was like, no, this is good to go. And then you do hear more from other people. But while I was still editing, I did have a couple beta readers look at it, just not necessarily professional, but just people who are into reading and to say what their experience was of reading it and whether anything kind of jumped out at them. So that didn't result in any huge changes, but some minor changes. And then so it was kind of kind of a convoluted process with my old agent because first she was at one agency and had requested the manuscript, and then I like never heard from her. And then another agent there was like, "Oh, she's not here anymore, but here are the changes that I would suggest." And
Oh,
yeah.
no.
Yeah. So I at first I was like, whatever, like why would I even, but then I did. And then his advice had been like, make it much more obvious, make the clues really like way more obvious, more clues. And then the original agent kind of popped up again at a different agency and was like, "Oh, it's me again. I want to I want to see your manuscript." And then seeing it after I had made the changes that the other one suggested, she was like, "No, it's way too obvious now, like unobvious it." And then later, once I was actually working with her, it was a lot of edits. Definitely a very editorial process for, what do I want to say, months. Yeah, definitely lots of months. And then definitely also from my publisher, more revisions, which is also a lot. And I think in the first moment of seeing someone else's revisions, it's like I have to just like look at the most minor things first that are like a typo or something because it's just like hit a wall when I see like these like big scene revisions. I'm like, whoa. So I just need some time to process it first. And it's also like sometimes it's the process of being like, no, this is how I want it. But you do have to like really, really look closely and be open to it and try phrasing it different ways. And so even in the case where I decide, no, I absolutely want to keep it this way, it's still worthwhile to have had the feedback because then it's like I've, in each instance gone through and looked at like, yeah, is this important enough for me to push back on it?
Yeah.
Am I sure? So
I would imagine, especially for literary fiction, like that, the line editing has got to be pretty intense because I have done some editing for people who definitely lean more literary in tone, and I love it because I love that kind of writing. But it is so challenging and time consuming. Can you talk a little bit just about like what that process was like for you, like seeing those edits and working through all of that?
sure. I think one thing that's challenging is, and this is not at all to say that other people aren't putting thought into their sentence or something, but on the level of having put so much thought into kind of style and phrasing, then I can imagine at least that there's maybe more resistance from people who are pursuing that kind of style. I definitely think that there were moments when maybe I had wanted to use a more unconventional phrasing and I, was really into it. And it is always like, okay, at what point is it, my unique style? And at what point is this going to be like unintelligible for a reader? So that's a delicate balance. I mean, you're writing the book to be read and understood and that people connect with it, but you also want it to be your voice and, in sync with this character you've created. So there is definitely like a process of weighing all those factors and overcoming your own internal resistance to
Do you
certain
remember any
changes.
specific maybe sentence or line that was like particularly hard for you to like accept that the change needed to happen?
Well, I think this is actually not even a big thing, but one thing that I do remember was in terms of wording, there was a part where I said the character wanted to make himself proof against hope, like proof in the sense of like waterproof or fireproof
Hmm.
or, that kind of proof. But, first my agent was like, I don't understand what this sentence is saying. It's like, it sounds like evidence. And I was like, no, it's this. And then also the publisher said the same thing. And I was like, okay, obviously no one can understand this sentence. And I liked it, but it's gone. I think what was then kind of sometimes hard was, I guess, in dialogue. I do kind of know my characters so well by that point. Then someone's like, would they really say this? Or like, why would they think this? Then I'm like, of course they would say this. Of course that's their thought process. But obviously, when people are questioning it, you really have to ask yourself, am I getting it across? Is it logical for the reader? So that's hard.
Yeah, especially I love that you mentioned at the very beginning about interiority. And do you want to talk a little bit more about what that is and maybe how you try to express that in your writing?
I think it's just really all about seeing the world through the character's eyes. And it's not just seeing things from the perspective, but it's their way of thinking about stuff. And for example, the way that they assume that other people see them. For example, I mentioned how Simon and What I Know About July is anxious and insecure. Has a lot of social anxiety and imposter syndrome. So there's just so many moments where he's thinking, oh, I look so stupid. That person's looking at me weird. I must seem like such and such. Oh, I shouldn't do this because this person will think poorly of me, or how will it look if I do this? Or, there's a scene where his sister's very, very active in doing, charitable projects, and he's trying to, help raise awareness for her. And he's like, oh, everyone can tell that I'm faking this and I have no idea what I'm talking about. And, we as the reader kind of might know at a distance that's not what I would think if I saw someone at a concert talk about a charity. I would never have that thought. But, then it's about the experience of being in his head, and that's how he sees the situation. Or, just little things like Susie also has anxiety about, hygiene type things, you know, being offered a glass of water at the police station and thinking like, who used this cup last? Or, just things where someone else might think, is that really relevant right now? But, just making that consistent throughout the book, just like an experience where it's, even if you're a totally different character, or a person, it's as it's called in reality, totally different person.
We're all playing characters.
Yeah.
We're all people
Yes.
playing
Yes.
characters.
Exactly. So that you would just, every experience, every scene, it's from that person's perspective, what they're experiencing, the sensory experience, the thought process, just all of it.
I love interiority when it's done well so much because it really is like you really are getting into the mind of another character and seeing the world through their eyes. And to me, that is like such a way to build empathy with somebody because it's like, oh, of course, if that's the first thought that's coming to your mind in this situation, that's the way that you're going to respond, like
Yeah, yeah.
so I love that. And I think what's really important is like you're talking about how your character Simon has all of this insecurity. And that is going to be expressed in the way that he thinks and also in the way that he describes things in the world. And it's going to be completely different than if he was a narcissist.
Yeah.
When you have a character, how do you go about developing their inner voice and making sure it's, or at least trying to make it different from your voice as the writer?
It's definitely kind of a multi-stage process. Like, I think at first thinking about just the very biggest character traits, or the ones that are going to play the biggest role, like, about being being anxious is something that was kind of a starting point, and being insecure because I did want to have that contrast to kind of how the fan worships him and how he feels about himself. But then over time, just making that more complex and discovering the other facets of the character. For example, Simon also kind of has this striving to be good and thinking a lot about how can I be a good person and not just how can I appear favorably to others, but how can I within myself be better than I am now? And there's this contrast because, he's had this totally messy life. He's been at rehab. He's been a womanizer, just picking up all his fans and stuff. He's just done all this stuff that he then himself kind of doesn't approve of or doesn't want to be connected with. So, in writing an early draft, it's definitely about discovering all those different facets and seeing how they interact with each other and come together to form like a cohesive whole person. But then again, here we are back at editing. It's about going through again and making sure it's consistent and not just with the protagonist whose perspective we see, but with all the characters, for example, dialogue being consistent, but they always talk in their own unique voice and they don't all sound the same as each other. And also they do sound the same as themselves and to themselves. So yeah, a lot of passes with editing over that.
What is something that you wish like more people knew about literary fiction and literary thrillers and like the genre that you're writing in? People who maybe don't read that genre, what are they missing out on?
I'll say I think that many people who don't read literary fiction might have the idea that it's has to be super dense or difficult to read or dry or something. And there absolutely are literary fiction books like that. I don't really like to read books like that. I mean, I read pretty much all literary fiction, but I read things that, are not easy to read in the sense of it's for a second grader, but that flow and are often page turners or you're invested in quickly. So yeah, I think, people should know it's not smarter or more literary if it's hard to read or dull. So it doesn't have to be like that.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for saying that. That's yeah.
Had to be said.
Um, yes. All right. Well, I did want to get a chance, first of all, for you to tell people where they can find you and find your books. And then I'd love to talk to you about maybe some book recommendations.
Sure. Yeah, I am on, I guess, all the social media that are age appropriate to me.
What does that mean?
Instagram. I mean, I don't know how to use Snapchat. I'm too old to
Oh,
use
okay.
that. I don't know if that's relevant to books even. Yeah, I'll just say Instagram. I'm on it. And I have a website which is kathausler.com, just like my name, easy to remember. And yeah, my books are pretty much if you're in Berlin, which maybe not many people listening to are, but Ivalon's has copies. Otherwise, anywhere you usually order books, your bookstore can order it, bookshop.org, anywhere that you want to order it, it's there.
And what are the two titles?
Oh, yeah. Retrograde is my first novel, and What I Know About July is my new novel. And also you can order it straight from Meerkat Press also. They have a shop, and sometimes there are goodies, sometimes there aren't. You'll see. And then book recommendations. Let's see, all the books.
Every book.
Yes. No, I know I love Daphne du Maurier, as you can imagine. I think kind of just like very early important literary thriller person. I know, I feel like everybody I talk to has always read Rebecca. I love My Cousin Rachel. That's fun.
Oh,
Uh,
actually, I think I've read that too.
yeah, it's dark.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also I feel like a lot of people don't know that she wrote The Birds, which is just a short story, but that's creepy. It's creepier than
Oh,
the movie for sure.
I did not know that.
Yeah. So modern stuff of literary thrillers, one I really like because I'm a Shakespeare nerd is If We Were Villains. So much Shakespeare nerdery in that. It's like a kind of theater school type setting, dark academia. And oh, so this is not a mystery, but what's it called? Things Bright and Beautiful. A lot of creepy, random kind of exorcism type things going on, but also about I kind of really like books where the the scariness is like the social interaction that is happening. Oh, Severance is one that is, probably a literary zombie novel I've read, but definitely worth reading.
Hopefully not the last. Hopefully we will get more literary zombie novels.
I'm sure there are more out there even now. I just have to discover them.
And that's the show. If you'd like to find out what I know about July, check out kathausler.com. And if you're in need of a little literary assistance, check out my editing services on midwrite.com or reach out to me on Instagram at midwriteworlds. If you enjoy the show, please leave me a rating and review on your preferred podcasting service. And of course, if you have any ideas for topics or guests, feel free to send them my way at eddabuddieспod@gmail.com. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time.